So Ethan Klein made a big, long video about Hasan Piker. He called it a content nuke of Hasan Piker, and I watched this. I actually watched the whole thing. I wasn't really planning to watch the whole thing, but I did because I wanted to figure out sort of what his angle was against Hasan. I already kind of knew the gist of it, but I also just thought it might be an interesting dynamic in terms of Ethan Klein, who is sort of a self-described liberal, or, you know, maybe like slightly to the left, like social democrat, and Hasan, who is further left than that. And Ethan essentially contends at the beginning of the video that Hasan tricked him into thinking that he was more of a moderate liberal than he is. And the gist of the overall video is that Hasan uses his platform to platform terrorists and anti-Semitism uncritically, and that Hasan is essentially ushering in anti-Semitism with his platform, with uncritical coverage of groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis and whatnot. And I think that there is some validity to that, because Hasan, you know, definitely platformed a guy who claimed to be a Houthi rebel fighter of some kind, and he played videos on the stream that were like some kind of Hezbollah or Houthi propaganda, and that's certainly worthy of criticism. And the more you dive into different resistance groups like that, you definitely find anti-Semitism. It's part of, if not what motivates their propaganda and the things that they say, it is at least a side effect of their politics and their sort of geopolitical situation. And that would be kind of the point that Hasan would make, is that anti-Semitism is relatively undeniable, coming from a lot of these rebel fighter types, or just people who are aligned with that. But it is a side effect of the conditions that are imposed upon them by what essentially amounts to the greatest force of oppression that these people know in their lives. And that context is important. But it is, you know, you could definitely make the case that there is no acceptable context for anti-Semitism, hating Jews as a whole, that sort of thing. And while Ethan does try to make the case that these are people who are attacking Jews as a whole under the guise of attacking Zionism, I don't think that he really substantiates that very well. And I think that there are some examples of like blatant anti-Semitism, but for the most part, what you're talking about is anti-Zionism. And even if you make the case that that is cover for real anti-Semitism, and in some cases I think it is, it also kind of ignores the fact that the core motivating enemy, you could say, for these people is Zionism and not necessarily Jews. And even if they have something on, I believe it was the Houthi flag that says "a curse upon the Jews" or something like that, that's blatant, explicit anti-Semitism. But you can make the case that that anti-Semitism only exists because of the oppressive conditions that these people are forced to live under. And from Israel, what we see is a continual reinforcement of those conditions of total oppression, total obliteration in the name of Israel and Zionism. And now, under Trump, almost certainly what we are going to see is Zionist expansion, either into Gaza or further annexation of different areas in the same way as the West Bank, or the fact that Israel has still not left Lebanon, despite the fact that a ceasefire agreement was signed with Lebanon before a ceasefire agreement was signed with Hamas. And so, at one point, an interesting quote, about halfway through the video maybe, Ethan says that Hasan continually siding with terrorist groups, resistance groups, whichever you would want to call them, is what continues to drive the conflict. And he does say that very specifically. He's, that Hasan consistently taking that position is what drives the conflict and makes it so that there is no agreement between these two sides. And I think that not only is it ridiculous, but it also kind of gets to the core of the flaw in Ethan's thinking here. I can understand Ethan being alarmed and upset, even to the point of cutting ties or positioning himself against Hasan for, his perception that he's like laundering anti-Semitism in some way. I don't share that perspective, but I do see where he's coming from, because I can see how, stripped of context and stripped of historical context, the things that Hasan is saying is kind of glorifying of people who, if you look at some of the things they say, they are anti-Semitic. But he is also centering Hasan, and I guess you could say commentary like Hasan's, in a very interesting way that, much like many people who are either explicitly pro-Zionist or who say they are not Zionist but kind of run cover for Zionism, that's where I would put Ethan Klein. I don't think Ethan Klein is a Zionist, but he is somebody who has lived in Israel. He says that he has a close connection with the people of Israel and with that country. And so while he has been critical of the genocide in Gaza, I don't know if he's used those terms, but he has been critical of the obliteration of Gaza by Israel. So he doesn't seem to believe in that. But from what I've heard him say, he does seem to kind of believe in the necessity for some kind of action of that type. And so to say that Hasan uncritically covering the perspectives of people who hate Zionism, even to an extent that might get dark and anti-Semitic at some point. And to be clear, that's not what people were saying to Hasan on his platform. Ethan is saying that people Hasan talked to, like this kid from TikTok, this was a big deal that Hasan platformed this kid. A lot of people were talking about it because he does have, anti-Semitic tweets and just things that either are explicitly anti-Semitic or sort of vague gestures at anti-Semitism. But the idea that Hasan platforming somebody like that drives the conflict forward, rather than the idea that the people that are actively progenerating the conflict, the government of Israel, the IDF, Western powers like the United States, if we're talking about the driving force of the conflict, you're talking about the weapons that are being supplied in large numbers, the massive amounts of deaths that are being carried out and then covered for. And you could make an argument that Hasan, refusing to criticize anti-Semitism of people who are on the other side of that conflict does harm. That's valid. And maybe it's even true that his coverage of the conflict or of those people prevents viewers from understanding the perspective of people who are frightened of these people's anti-Semitism or of just their general resistance tactics as a whole. It probably does do that. Hasan's coverage is not meant to present Zionists favorably or even in a nuanced light. And so if you want to criticize Hasan for that, I suppose you can, except there's a lot of people who fall into that category, especially now, who have no interest in covering Israel and Zionism favorably or in a nuanced way. And I would say that is the fault of no one other than Israel and the Western propaganda that launders the actions of Israel. And what we're seeing, in my opinion, is a moment in history where it's become very clear to people, a lot more people than was previously the case, that the way Western media covers Israel and Israel's actions in Gaza and in the region in general don't really match up. And so what this does is it removes people's motivation to hear a nuanced perspective of people who are obliterating any and all civilians that they can on the other side. And now, obviously, we're at this moment of a ceasefire now, and that's another thing that is a little curious to me about this video on the part of Ethan. I can only assume that Ethan started this video a little while ago, a few weeks ago, before the ceasefire happened, because I don't know. I don't want to say I don't see the relevance of it, because the Israel-Palestine conflict is not going to go away. But I just don't know what the utility is of criticizing Hasan in that way and kind of continuing to make the case that Zionism and the Zionist project of Israel is covered unfairly by the left. That seems to be, if not Ethan's explicit case that he's making, it seems to be at least like what motivates him, is that he feels that the left is unfairly biased against the motivations of Zionists. And the left does not usually contend with the fact that, as Ethan says in his video, that many Jews are in Israel because they were forced out of the surrounding countries that they did live in by the Arab populations and things like that. And, I can recognize the truth in the fact that the left is not interested in covering that perspective. And so there's possibly a little bit of a disbalance there. But to me, the issue with making a video like this right now is that not only has the conflict ceased for now, but it has ceased under the exact same conditions that allowed it to happen in the first place. The West, in terms of its leadership and government, is no less friendly to Zionism and the Zionist project than it was after October 7th. And if anything, it's more friendly. We now have a president in office who has absolutely no reason to try to rein in Netanyahu's slaughter of Palestinians. And I think it's pretty clear that the only reason he wanted the ceasefire was so that he could look good walking into office. And that worked in his favor. So I think the fundamental problem here is that what Ethan is focusing on is Hasan's coverage, which he views as either anti-Semitic or rehabilitative of terrorists. And I think the context that's missing there is that Hasan is kind of covering these so-called terrorist groups, or literal terrorist groups in some cases, in the same uncritical way that Israel has enjoyed coverage from the West for always. And so while there are flaws in that coverage, and I don't necessarily like anybody who does an interview with a radical person who has questionable or hateful beliefs, doing an interview with that person uncritically, I think is irresponsible. And I think that Hasan has too big of a platform for that, and that, if he's going to do journalism, which he's been doing more of lately, he should take seriously the responsibility to give people tough questions, because you don't want to be guilty of the same thing that the Western media is guilty of when it comes to conflicts and even genocides that they do not have interest in criticizing. However, to say that those two things are the same, to say that covering Israel favorably and uncritically is the same as covering the resistance groups against Israel uncritically, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of the dynamic. And I understand why people would want to go for that perspective, because it's tempting to want to find the middle of the conflict and to say that the middle is the perspective that criticizes both sides equally, and that is the best way to analyze media, analyze political conflicts. I think we need to do away with that, because, at least in some cases, by putting yourself in the middle, you are actually allowing yourself to be manipulated more than you would if you were more to one side or the other. And one of the contentions that Ethan makes here is that he feels that Hasan manipulated him, because Hasan has said at points that liberals are easy to manipulate. He was not, in that context, talking about manipulating liberals to get them to believe in left-wing ideas. He very much presents it that way. Like Hasan was saying, oh, liberals are the most easily manipulated people on the planet. But he was talking about the way that liberals are constantly pulled to the right, which they are. And that is as a function of their desire to play to the middle, rather than recognizing power dynamics and power imbalance in any given situation. And so, while I think that Ethan makes some good points about Hasan being a little bit blasé when covering, pretty radical people, or you could say very blasé, the function of that is to create a balance in the Western perspective and the Western media diet that simply does not exist without figures like Hasan interviewing people from Houthi rebel groups, terror groups, etc., Hamas, whatever. I don't think he ever has interviewed anybody from Hamas, but there was like this Houthi rebel kid, and then, he has said some kind of favorable or waffly things about Hamas. And one thing that Ethan spends a decent amount of time on in the video is actually the platform of Twitch. So he goes from talking about Hasan to saying that there's an anti-Semitism problem at Twitch in general, and basically makes the case that all of this coverage not being punished in some way, or some of the things that Hasan and others have said not being punished in some way by Twitch, shows an anti-Semitism problem at Twitch. But that right there is the fundamental issue with trying to play to the middle when that middle ground doesn't really exist. Because by saying that Twitch should not allow the speech of somebody like Hasan and the people that he interviews, even if you view that coverage as unduly positive, you're essentially advocating for a media landscape that is entirely favorable to Israel. I mean, if we did not have perspectives like Hasan and people who are willing to interview some of these people who are called terrorists by the media and that we are told are completely off limits, then in what mainstream way would those perspectives get any coverage at all? And not to mention the fact that if you are going to start wiping coverage and perspectives like that on the basis of anti-Semitism, which in some small cases you could argue there's justification for, how many steps away is it to then purge the perspectives of people who are moderately anti-Zionist? And at one point, he points to somebody who was in the head of policy and community at Twitch, and says that this person was previously fired from the job that they had before Twitch because she doesn't like the Jews. That's what Ethan said about her. But then in the sources that he shows on screen, all the woman said is that Israel is guilty of ethnic cleansing. And so that is the kind of pretty modest, honestly, and fairly objectively true criticism of Israel that the entire Western media landscape is fully hostile to the extent that this woman lost her job because of it. And not only is Ethan Klein advocating for essentially that same bias to be dominant in Western media, but he is also falling victim to the same sleight of hand that criticizing Israel by saying they're guilty of ethnic cleansing is equivalent to anti-Semitism and that she doesn't like the Jews. And So sort of this is what colors his perspective. And when he criticizes Twitch for, in his view, being too lax on certain criticisms of Israel, sometimes radical or edgy language talking about Israel, he is essentially advocating for the same bias that is already dominant in Western culture and Western media that completely blacklists any criticism of Israel at all. That by accusing Israel of ethnic cleansing, you are anti-Semitic. And that's an inversion of the entire point that we are supposed to be, the entire reason that we are supposed to be alert to anti-Semitism, being that allowing casual anti-Semitism is what leads up and sets the stage for actual genocides and violence to happen. And I'm sensitive to that perspective. But if you can't look at what Israel's doing and call it an ethnic cleansing without losing your job, well, you are then essentially being incentivized by a society at large to not say what you see in the case of Israel, because the accusation of anti-Semitism is just going to be weaponized against you. And so when he is criticizing Twitch for not being harsh enough on those kinds of, on that type of language, allowing creators who say, you know, edgy or in some cases pretty radical things against Israel, and I'm not talking about explicit anti-Semitism, I'm talking about criticisms of Israel or you could say glorifications of the enemies of Israel, and conflating that with anti-Semitism. He's essentially just saying that he does not like Twitch's approach to what you could call free speech on the platform. And as a liberal, I'm sure that Ethan Klein has made the case before that the reason platforms have the right to police whatever language they want on their platform. You can't say slurs, you can't say, you know, threaten violence explicitly and that sort of thing, is because those platforms have free speech and they actually don't have an obligation to protect your free speech. And they're allowed to police your language on their platform to whatever extent they want. That also goes the opposite way. And you know, if we're talking about explicit calls to violence or explicit use of slurs and that sort of thing, then sure, you can make the case that some punishment is due in that case. But short of that, you have no right to claim that Twitch should be deplatforming people for criticisms of Israel that you view as anti-Semitic. It falls under the same category of free speech. And the only reason that even Ethan's moderate criticisms of Israel as an Israeli have the breathing room that they do in American society is because of the chipping away at the hegemonic perspective that has dominated for generations when it comes to Israel, that Israel is in the right because Jews are victims of anti-Semitism, and that is only starting to wither a little bit because of platforms like Twitch and TikTok that allow a fair amount of free speech to the opposite point, making the case that what Israel is doing is straightforward genocide, showing images of what Israel is doing in explicit ways, and maybe not just some flash shots of all the neighborhoods destroyed, but like showing that alongside information of how this conflict has played out, what Israel's military actions have been versus what they said they were going to do, just like the siege of Rafah and things like that. The only reason we're getting good information about that is because platforms like Twitch and TikTok do not police so-called anti-Semitism to the same standard that has been the norm in America since the inception of Israel. And in a landscape where there are no platforms that allow for that kind of speech, even the criticisms that Ethan is willing to levy against Israel are at risk of being fully shut down. It's really not that hard to imagine Ethan himself and his very moderate criticisms of Israel being painted as anti-Semitic, and he's a traitor or whatever, a self-hating Jew, and that the case being made for him to be removed from the platforms that he's on because of it. And that's exactly the type of environment that he is pointing to when he is uncritically saying that this woman was fired from her previous job because she doesn't like the Jews, even though what she said was that Israel is committing an ethnic cleansing. If we can't say that out loud about Israel, then there's a very serious problem about the power that Israel has in our society in terms of what they're allowed to get away with. And this is the same for any U.S. ally, and certainly the U.S. itself. Anything that the U.S. does, regardless of the methods used, regardless of if our soldiers rape, murder, enslave non-combatants, which we have done throughout history, criticizing that makes you a terrorist, and glorifying that makes you a patriot. And so that, to me, is kind of the same perspective that Ethan is coming from. And a lot of this video seems kind of focused on what I would call like the aesthetics of terrorism, because he's making the case that Hasan glorifies terrorists, and these terrorist groups that Hasan is platforming essentially poison the well and make Hasan an unjustifiable media figure. However, if we're talking about terrorism as a broader definition that could be applied to anyone, obviously America, you could say, is guilty of terrorism. You could definitely say that Israel is guilty of terrorism. And not only that, but they've done so to an extent that is so much more destructive, so much more indiscriminate, and just so much more empowered by the powers that be in the current power structure of the world. And so when glorifying or uncritically covering the violence of terrorist or resistance groups, that is like unsalvageable terrorism apology. But then to kind of make casual comments about Yoav Gallant, one of the guys who, alongside Benjamin Netanyahu, was charged with war crimes, you know, him and Ela on their platform kind of casually said, oh, this guy, he seems like a good guy. He wanted to end the war, blah, blah, blah. And so, I mean, in what way is that also not justification of terrorism and whitewashing of terrorism? In my view, it's the same thing, except in the case of Israel, it is much more normalized for us to glorify, pacify, and make excuses for that terrorism. And it's really just the aesthetics of these videos that Hasan was playing, what the people look like, what the language sounds like, that makes people associate it so much more closely with terrorism. Whereas when it comes to the things that Israel is doing, people are a lot more willing to say things like, well, war is brutal no matter what, and war is awful, and it's a shame that it has come to this, and that sort of thing. And I'm pretty sure that Ethan has said things of that nature when it comes to Israel as well. So I think I'll leave it at that. But the main reason I'm making this point is because while I think that there's some valid criticisms to be made of Hasan, I don't think he's always the most critical of the perspectives that he's covering. He may not be the most thorough. I think he's a very good communicator and explainer of certain things, but he may not be the most thorough in sort of really covering it in a broad way, so that people who might come from the opposite perspective or who might want to criticize him from the opposite perspective can be kind of disempowered in their criticism. I think Hasan kind of gives ammo to people who want to criticize him by being just a little bit brazen in what he says, and sometimes just a little bit uncritical in what he says. And in connection with anti-Semitism and people who are anti-Semitic, it's fair to criticize him over that. But I think ultimately that this project of Ethan's to kind of remove Hasan from the mainstream is actually more harmful than anything to the current media landscape, because especially as we're entering into the second Trump administration, they are cracking down hard on anything. They're deporting people who are foreign students who are going to school in America who are criticizing Israel and supporting Palestine. That's blatant fascism. And so while I'm not going to conflate Ethan's beliefs with that type of behavior, I do think that Ethan's coverage of the subject and focus on this subject and his desire to remove a person like Hasan from the popular discourse is in service of that same end, and only will help somebody like Trump in his eradication of any type of criticism of Israel from the public discourse. And that's bad. And I think even though Hasan is a flawed commentator, I think that his work, his journalism, the interviews that he did with the firefighters during the LA fires, the prisoners who are enlisted to fight the fires, and even his willingness to interview Houthi combatants and things like that, that's more valuable to the Western media landscape than whatever the fuck a content nuke is.